The year was 1844, a time when horses pulled carriages and letters traveled slowly. In a quiet little town, nestled by a gentle river, something truly special was about to happen. The town itself was like many others, with a bustling market square, a friendly baker who made the best bread, and houses with smoke curling from their chimneys. It was a place where everyone knew everyone, and news, good or bad, traveled faster than any horse. In one of these cozy homes lived a young couple, Sarah and Thomas. They had been waiting for a very long time, for a baby to join their family. Before we continue, make sure to like and subscribe to never miss a new video. And tell me, where are you watching this video from? I love seeing all different people come together for these stories. The whole town was excited for them too, wondering if it would be a boy or a girl. Finally, on a crisp autumn morning, a new baby arrived. His name was John. Baby John was a perfect little bundle of joy. He had soft, rosy cheeks and tiny fingers that gripped onto his mother's hand. His eyes, when open, were a bright, curious blue. He weighed a healthy 7 pounds and 10 ounces, and his cries were strong and clear, just like any other happy, healthy babies. Sarah and Thomas couldn't stop smiling. They held him close, marveling at his tiny nose and the little tuft of dark hair on his head. He was everything they had dreamed of and more. The midwife, a kind woman named Martha, who had helped many babies into the world, declared John to be one of the finest she'd ever seen. "A strong boy," she said, patting Thomas on the shoulder. "He'll bring you much happiness." And indeed, John did. For the first few days, his life was filled with gentle sleeps, warm milk, and the loving gazes of his parents. He cooed and gurgled, making all the sweet small sounds babies make. No one, not even his parents, could have guessed the amazing secret that lay hidden within this happy, healthy baby boy. Little John's arrival filled the small house with a joy Sarah and Thomas had never known. They had dreamed of this moment for so long, picturing a child's laughter echoing through their rooms. Now, that dream was real. Every morning, Sarah would gently lift John from his cradle, her heart swelling with love. She would whisper sweet songs to him, admiring his tiny fingers and toes. Thomas, usually busy with his work as a carpenter, found himself hurrying home each day, eager to see his son. He loved to hold John, feeling the baby's warm, soft weight in his strong arms. Thomas would gently rock him, making soft buzzing sounds that always seemed to make John smile. They were completely enchanted by their little boy. Sarah spent hours just watching John sleep, his chest rising and falling softly. She thought about all the things they would teach him, how to read, how to draw, how to be kind. Thomas, in turn, imagined teaching John how to build things with wood, how to fix a fence, and how to tell a good story. Every blink, every yawn, every little stretch John made was a miracle to them. They were first-time parents, and everything felt new and exciting. They carefully chose soft blankets and tiny clothes. They made sure his cradle was warm and cozy. Their conversations often turned to John, talking about his funny little expressions or how much milk he drank. Their love for him grew bigger each day, filling their home with a warmth that chased away any cold. They truly believed John was the most wonderful baby in the whole wide world, and they couldn't wait to see him grow and discover the world around him. Life with baby John settled into a peaceful rhythm. Days were filled with soft giggles, tiny yawns, and the gentle sounds of a happy infant. Sarah and Thomas watched him grow, celebrating each new little thing he did. One sunny afternoon, A few weeks after John was born, Sarah was knitting by the window, while John lay playing on a blanket on the floor. He was batting at a wooden rattle, making soft goo-goo noises, just like any baby his age. Suddenly, a strange sound filled the room. It wasn't a cry, not a gurgle, and certainly not the sweet coo Sarah was used to. It was a deep, rumbling noise, like a growl that was trying to be something else. Sarah paused, her knitting needle still. She looked around the room, wondering where the sound came from. Was it the cat? No, the cat was sleeping soundly by the fireplace. Was it a neighbor's dog? The sound seemed to come from inside their house. She looked down at John. He was still lying on his back, his eyes wide, looking up at the ceiling. Then it happened again. The same low, rough sound, a little longer this time. It was definitely coming from John. Sarah felt a shiver run down her back. It was not a baby's sound at all. It was much too deep, much too old. It sounded like someone clearing their throat after a long sleep, or like a very big dog giving a soft bark. John wasn't crying. He wasn't upset. He was just making this odd, deep noise. Sarah leaned closer, a tiny frown on her face. What on earth was that? She had never heard a baby make such a noise before. It made the quiet room feel very different all of a sudden. She waited, her heart thumping softly, to see if he would do it again. Sarah waited, holding her breath, but John didn't make the strange noise again that day. She tried to tell Thomas about it that evening, but he just smiled and said, "Babies make all sorts of funny sounds, my dear. He's just finding his voice." Sarah wanted to believe him, but a tiny worry settled in her heart. A few days later, the worry turned into something much bigger. Thomas was home, playing with John on the rug. Sarah was preparing dinner, humming a tune. John was reaching for a colorful wooden block, his little hands batting at it. Thomas held the block just out of his reach, laughing softly. "Come on, John," he said. "Can you get it?" Then it happened. John stretched out his arm, his tiny brow furrowed in concentration. And from his little mouth came two words, clear as a bell, but in a voice that made both Sarah and Thomas freeze. "Give here," John said. But it wasn't a baby's sweet, high-pitched babble. It was a voice that sounded like a very old man, deep and raspy, as if he had been speaking for 100 years. It was the same strange, low rumble Sarah had heard before, but this time it formed words. Thomas dropped the block with a clatter. Sarah spun around from the stove, her eyes wide with shock. John, completely unaware of the surprise he had caused, looked up at his father. He opened his mouth again, and the deep voice spoke once more. "Block." He sounded impatient, like an old grandpa waiting for his tea. Sarah gasped, covering her mouth with her hand. Thomas stared at their baby, his face pale. This was not just a strange sound. This was their baby, John, speaking his first words, but with a voice that belonged to someone very, very old. The room grew silent, except for the soft crackle of the fire. The silence in the room stretched, thick and heavy. Sarah and Thomas looked at each other, then back at their baby, John. He was still reaching for the block, completely unaware of the stunned faces of his parents. Thomas slowly bent down and picked up the wooden block, his hand shaking a little. He handed it to John. "Here you go, son," he whispered, his own voice sounding weak. John took the block and put it in his mouth, a normal baby thing to do. But the sound of his words, those deep old words, echoed in their minds. Sarah sank into a chair, her eyes fixed on John. "Did you hear that, Thomas?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. His voice. It sounded like my grandfather. Thomas nodded, his brow furrowed with a mix of fear and confusion. "I heard it, Sarah. It was like nothing I've ever heard from a baby before. It was so deep, so rough." He walked over to Sarah and put his arm around her. They both stared at John, who was now happily gumming his block. He looked so innocent, so small. How could such a tiny body make such a big old sound? A wave of worry washed over them. Was John sick? Was something wrong with him? They had imagined his first words would be sweet coos or a soft mama or dada. Instead, they got a voice that sounded like it had lived a very long life. It wasn't just strange, it was scary. They were afraid for their baby. They loved him more than anything, but this was so unusual. They wondered if anyone else would believe them, or if they would think they were making it up. The joy they had felt just moments before was now mixed with a deep, unsettling fear for their dear son. The next morning, Sarah and Thomas decided they had to tell someone. This secret was too big and too strange to keep to themselves. They chose to visit Sarah's sister, Mary, who lived just a few doors down. Mary was kind and sensible, and they hoped she would offer some comfort, or at least believe them. "You won't believe what happened yesterday," Sarah began, her voice still shaky as they sat in Mary's cozy kitchen. Thomas nodded, adding, "John spoke his first words." Mary smiled, her eyes lighting up. "Oh, how wonderful! What did he say? Mama? Dada?" Sarah and Thomas exchanged a look. "Well," Thomas started, "he said give here and then block." Mary's smile widened. "That's amazing for such a young baby. So clever." "But Mary," Sarah interrupted, her voice serious, "it wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it. His voice. It was deep, like an old man's, raspy and low." Mary laughed gently, thinking they were joking. "Oh, come now, Sarah. You're just tired. Babies have sweet little voices. Perhaps you imagined it." "We both heard it," Thomas insisted, his voice rising a little. "It was like Grandpa Elias speaking, clear as day." Mary shook her head, still smiling. "Thomas, you know how much you both want John to be special. But a baby with an old man's voice? That's quite a tale. Maybe he just made a funny gurgle that sounded a bit rough." She patted Sarah's hand kindly. "Don't worry yourselves. He's a healthy boy." Sarah and Thomas left Mary's house feeling even more alone. They tried telling a few other friends and even Thomas's brother, but the reaction was always the same. A polite smile, a gentle laugh, and a clear disbelief. No one could imagine a baby speaking in such a way. They just thought the new parents were tired or imagining things. It was clear that without hearing it themselves, no one would ever believe their unbelievable story. Days turned into weeks, and Sarah and Thomas kept their secret close. John continued to be a sweet, happy baby, but every now and then he would utter a word or two in that strange, deep voice. It was always a surprise, and it always made their hearts leap with a mix of wonder and worry. They were starting to feel very alone with this secret. Then, one Sunday, Thomas's father, Grandpa Elias, came for his usual visit. Grandpa Elias was a jolly old man, with a long white beard and a booming laugh. He loved his grandson very much, and always brought John a small wooden toy he had carved himself. Thomas and Sarah decided not to mention John's voice. What was the point? No one believed them anyway. Grandpa Elias sat in his favorite armchair, holding John on his lap. John, only a few months old, was playing with a small carved bird Grandpa had given him. "There's my little grandson," Grandpa boomed, his own voice deep and hearty. "Are you going to be a strong man like your father?" John gurgled happily, reaching for Grandpa Elias's long beard. Thomas and Sarah watched, a little nervous, wondering if John would speak. They had noticed John often spoke when he was excited or wanted something. Just then, John tugged hard on Grandpa's beard. "Ouch!" Grandpa exclaimed, laughing. John looked up at him, his blue eyes wide. And then, from John's tiny mouth, came a clear, deep voice, very much like Grandpa Elias's own. "Mine," John declared, holding tight to the beard. Grandpa Elias froze. His booming laugh stopped. His eyes, usually twinkling, grew wide. He looked down at John, then up at Thomas and Sarah, his mouth hanging slightly open. The little bird toy fell from his hand and clattered to the floor. Did that come from him?" Grandpa Elias whispered, his own voice now thin and full of surprise. Sarah and Thomas nodded slowly, relief and fear swirling in their chests. At last, someone had heard. Grandpa Elias slowly picked up the little carved bird, his eyes still wide with disbelief. He looked at John, who was now happily chewing on his beard again, completely innocent. "Well, I'll be," Grandpa mumbled, his voice a little hoarse. "I've heard of early talkers, but never like that." He cleared his throat, trying to make sense of what he'd just heard. Sarah, feeling a rush of relief that someone finally believed them, quickly explained everything. "We tried to tell Mary and your brother Thomas, but no one believed us. They thought we were imagining things." Grandpa Elias listened, nodding slowly. He looked at John again, a strange mix of emotions on his face. First, there was pure shock, then a deep wonder. But then, a little crinkle appeared at the corner of his eyes, and a small smile started to form. He let out a soft chuckle, which quickly grew into a hearty laugh. "A baby with the voice of an old sea captain," he boomed, his laugh filling the room. "Well, I never. It's certainly odd, yes, very odd indeed. But you must admit it's also a bit funny." He gently pulled John's tiny hand from his beard. "You're a cheeky one, aren't you, little John? Demanding my beard like a seasoned old man." Sarah and Thomas looked at each other, then back at Grandpa Elias. They hadn't thought of it as funny before, only scary and worrying. But seeing Grandpa laugh, a little of their own fear started to lift. It was still a mystery, but maybe it wasn't a bad mystery. Grandpa Elias bounced John gently on his knee. "This will be a story to tell for generations," he said, still chuckling. "My grandson, the baby with the voice of a wise old man." He found it very strange, yes, but the thought of his little grandson speaking with such an ancient sound also brought a twinkle to his eye. Grandpa Elias, being a lively and talkative man, could not keep such an astonishing secret to himself. The very next day, at the local general store, where folks gathered to chat, he leaned in close to Mr. Henderson, the store owner. "You won't believe what happened at Thomas and Sarah's yesterday," he whispered, a twinkle in his eye. Mr. Henderson, known for his love of a good story, listened with wide eyes as Grandpa Elias told him about John's deep, old voice. At first, Mr. Henderson chuckled, just like Mary had. "A baby with an old man's voice, Elias. Are you sure you weren't napping in your armchair?" But Grandpa Elias insisted, his voice serious now. "I heard it with my own 2 ears, Henderson. Clear as a bell, said mine, when he grabbed my beard. Sounded just like Old Man Tiber, rest his soul." Mr. Henderson stopped laughing. Old Man Tiber had a voice like gravel, a voice everyone in town remembered. If Elias, a man known for his honesty, said it was true, then maybe it was. He told Mrs. Gable, who was buying flour, and she told her neighbor, Mrs. Perkins, over the fence. Like wildfire, the story spread from house to house, from the baker's shop to the blacksmith's forge. People whispered about it at the well, and children told their friends in excited tones. "Did you hear about Sarah and Thomas's baby? They say he talks like a grown man." "No, not a grown man, an old man." At first, many still didn't believe it. It sounded too much like a tall tale. But the fact that Grandpa Elias, a respected elder, had vouched for it made people wonder. Soon, the quiet little town was buzzing with the news of baby John and his extraordinary voice. Everyone was curious, and many people wanted to see and hear this unusual baby for themselves. The secret was out, and the town would never be quite the same. The quiet peace of Sarah and Thomas's home quickly vanished. The very next day after Grandpa Elias shared his unbelievable story, a gentle knock came at their door. It was Mrs. Gable, the lady from the general store, with her friend, Mrs. Perkins. They apologized for bothering Sarah, but they were simply too curious. "We heard the most astonishing tale from Mr. Elias," Mrs. Gable began, her eyes darting towards John, who was sleeping peacefully in his cradle. "Is it truly possible?" Sarah, feeling a mix of annoyance and a strange kind of relief that people were finally curious rather than disbelieving, invited them in. She bounced John gently, hoping he might make a sound, but he remained quiet. The ladies waited patiently, whispering among themselves, their eyes wide with expectation. After a few minutes, with no strange words from John, they politely left, still wondering. But that was just the beginning. Soon, more people started to arrive. Mr. Henderson, the store owner, stopped by on his way home from work, claiming he needed to ask Thomas about some wood. Really, he just wanted a peek at the baby. Then came the baker, smelling of fresh bread, pretending he wanted to offer Sarah a special treat. Even young children, bold and excited, pressed their faces against the window pane, hoping to hear the talking baby. Sarah and Thomas found their days filled with unexpected visitors. Some were polite and left quickly. Others lingered, hoping to catch John in the act. They would sit for a long time, watching John gurgle and coo like any other baby, growing more and more doubtful. Then, just as they were about to give up, John would sometimes let out a clear, deep word or a short sentence in his old man's voice. Each time, gasps and whispers would fill the room, and the visitors' eyes would widen with shock. The stories of the baby with the old man's voice were indeed true, and everyone who heard it for themselves left the house utterly amazed. The parade of visitors to Sarah and Thomas's house brought with it a mix of feelings. When John did speak in his deep old voice, the reactions were never quite the same. Some people gasped, their eyes wide with genuine wonder. "It's a miracle," whispered Mrs. Gable, crossing herself. She thought it was a sign, something truly special from above. Others, like young Master Timmy, a boy who often helped Thomas with carpentry, found it incredibly exciting. "He's like a tiny wizard," Timmy declared, his eyes gleaming with amazement. He couldn't stop talking about the talking baby to his friends. But not everyone was so delighted. Old Farmer McGregor, a grumpy man who believed only in hard work and common sense, scowled. "Rubbish," he grumbled loudly, after John asked for his rattle in a voice that sounded like a grizzled sailor. "It's a trick, I tell you. Thomas must be hiding someone under the floorboards, making those noises." He stomped out, convinced it was all a clever prank. Some folks were downright scared. Mrs. Higgins, a timid woman, heard John say "cold" when a draft came through the window, and his deep voice made her jump. She whispered, her face pale, that it wasn't natural for a baby to speak that way, hinting that something not good might be behind it. She left quickly, clutching her shawl tight around her. Sarah and Thomas saw all these reactions. They saw the wide-eyed wonder, the excited smiles, the angry suspicion, and the trembling fear. It was a lot to take in. They just wanted their baby to be happy and safe, but his voice was causing such a stir. They watched John, who was still just a baby, playing with his toes, completely unaware of the many different feelings he stirred in the hearts of the townspeople. It was a strange time for the family, with their little home now a stage for a constant stream of curious onlookers. The constant stream of visitors and their varied reactions began to weigh heavily on Sarah and Thomas. They still worried about John, and the whispers of fear and suspicion made them uneasy. They wished they could get some real answers, not just gasps of wonder or angry accusations. One afternoon, a different kind of visitor arrived. It was Dr. Albright, the town's oldest and most respected physician. He was a kind man with a gentle smile and wise, tired eyes, known for his calm manner and sharp mind. He had heard the stories, of course, but unlike others, he didn't laugh or accuse. He was simply curious, and perhaps a little concerned for the family. "Good day, Sarah, Thomas," Dr. Albright said, tipping his hat. "I've heard some remarkable tales about your little John. With your permission, I'd be honored to examine him, purely out of medical interest, of course." Sarah and Thomas felt a wave of relief. Finally, someone who might understand, or at least try to. They welcomed him warmly. Dr. Albright sat by John's cradle, watching the baby carefully. He didn't rush. He observed John as he played with his fingers, cooing softly. "He seems a very healthy boy," the doctor noted, his voice calm. "No signs of distress, bright eyes." Sarah explained how John's voice would suddenly change. "It's not all the time, doctor. Sometimes he's just a normal baby." Dr. Albright nodded. He waited patiently, and after a few quiet minutes, John yawned, stretched, and then, in his remarkably deep old voice, he said, "Sleepy." Dr. Albright did not jump or gasp. His eyebrows simply raised a little, and a look of deep thought settled on his face. He watched John for a moment longer, a thoughtful hum escaping his lips. "Indeed," he murmured, "most interesting." He wasn't scared or amazed in the way others were. He was a doctor, and his mind was already at work, trying to find a medical explanation. After hearing John say "sleepy" in his deep old voice, Dr. Albright carefully picked up the baby. John looked up at him with curious blue eyes, completely trusting. The doctor gently opened John's tiny mouth and looked inside. He used a small, smooth stick to gently press down John's tongue, peering at his throat and vocal cords. Sarah and Thomas watched anxiously, hoping for an answer, a reason for this strange phenomenon. Dr. Albright hummed softly, his brow furrowed in thought. He saw nothing unusual. John's throat looked perfectly healthy, just like any other baby's. His vocal cords, though small, seemed to be working just fine. There were no bumps, no redness, nothing that looked out of place. Next, the doctor pulled out his stethoscope, a long, thin tube with 2 earpieces and a round metal disc. He warmed the disc in his hand before placing it gently on John's tiny chest. He listened carefully, moving the disc to different spots. He listened to John's breathing, which was steady and clear. He listened to his little heart, which beat with a strong, healthy rhythm. Again, there was nothing wrong. He checked John's ears, his nose, and even gently felt around his neck. Every part of John's little body seemed perfectly normal and healthy. There were no signs of illness, no strange lumps, no problems that might explain his unusual voice. He was a perfectly formed, perfectly healthy baby boy, in every way a doctor could see. Dr. Albright finally lowered John back into his mother's arms, a puzzled look still on his face. "Well," he said, shaking his head slowly, "I must say, young John appears to be in excellent health. His throat, his lungs, his heart, all seem to be functioning perfectly. There is nothing medically amiss that I can detect." He looked from Sarah to Thomas, his kind eyes showing his own confusion. He had expected to find something, anything, to explain the deep voice, but he had found absolutely nothing. Dr. Albright carefully put his stethoscope back into his bag, a deep frown on his face. He looked at Sarah and Thomas, his kind eyes clouded with confusion. "I have practiced medicine for over 40 years, he began, his voice slow and thoughtful, "and I have seen many strange things in my time. But this is truly beyond my understanding." He shook his head, a gesture of deep bewilderment. "Little John is, by all medical accounts, a perfectly healthy infant. His vocal cords are normal, his lungs strong. His entire system appears to be in excellent working order. There is simply no physical reason for him to produce sounds in such a deep, mature voice, especially not a voice that sounds so remarkably old." Sarah's heart sank a little. She had hoped the doctor would have an answer, a simple explanation that would take away their worry. Thomas looked equally disheartened. "So, you're saying you don't know why, Doctor?" he asked, his voice quiet. "Precisely," Dr. Albright admitted, a rare note of defeat in his tone. "I am utterly puzzled. I have never encountered a case like this in all my years. It defies all the medical knowledge I possess." He stroked his chin, lost in thought. "It is as if an old soul resides within a baby's body, or perhaps a trick of nature I cannot fathom." He paused, then added, "But I can assure you of one thing. John is not ill. He is not in any pain because of this. He is a healthy, thriving baby, despite his extraordinary voice." This news brought a small measure of comfort to Sarah and Thomas, but the mystery remained, as deep and puzzling as ever. The town's most learned doctor, a man who had seen it all, was left completely without answers. Even without an explanation from Dr. Albright, Sarah and Thomas felt a bit lighter. Knowing John was healthy, even if he was a medical mystery, eased some of their deepest fears. They still had a very unusual baby, but at least he wasn't sick. And as the days turned into weeks, John's unique way of speaking became more and more common. He didn't just say 1 or 2 words anymore. John was learning new words almost every day, just like any other baby. But each one came out in that same deep, gravelly voice. If he was hungry, he wouldn't just cry. He'd look up at Sarah with his big blue eyes and say, "Food," in a voice that sounded like a grizzled old sailor demanding his supper. When he wanted his favorite wooden block, he'd point and declare, "Block. Now." His tone was always serious, never childish or babbling. Sarah and Thomas started to get used to it. It was still startling sometimes, especially when he spoke unexpectedly from his cradle, making them jump. But they learned to understand him quickly. When Thomas was working in his workshop, John, sitting nearby in a little playpen, might call out, "Hammer," if he saw Thomas looking for it. Thomas would chuckle, shaking his head, and pick up the tool. He called Sarah Mother and Thomas Father, not in sweet baby talk, but with the clear, deep tones of a grown man. It was often strange, sometimes funny, and always amazing. He would ask for water or complain, "Wet," when his nappy needed changing. He never made the usual baby sounds like "mama" or "dada" in a high-pitched voice. It was always the old man's voice, full and deep, coming from his tiny, innocent face. John was growing, learning and speaking, always in his wonderfully strange old man's voice. John was still very much a baby, with all the needs and wants of any infant. He needed his milk, his naps, and his toys. But the way he asked for these things was what set him apart. It wasn't a baby's whimper for food. It was a firm request. One morning, Sarah was preparing breakfast when she heard a deep voice from the cradle. "Mother, hungry. Milk, please." She smiled, shaking her head. It was still so strange to hear such a demand from such a tiny person. She went to the cradle, and John looked up at her, his blue eyes earnest, waiting patiently. She picked him up and began to feed him. He drank his milk just like any baby, but the way he had asked for it was like an old man ordering his breakfast at the tavern. Later, Thomas was trying to read the newspaper, but John was wide awake, lying on a blanket, looking at his small collection of wooden toys. He reached for a red spinning top. When his tiny fingers couldn't quite grasp it, he didn't cry. Instead, a deep voice broke the quiet. "Father, top, give me the top." Thomas looked over the edge of his newspaper, startled for a moment, then chuckled. "All right, little boss," he said, reaching for the toy. "Here's your top." John took it, his face serious, and started to spin it with surprising dexterity for a baby. It was like a tiny professor asking for his tools, not a baby wanting to play. Even when he was tired, his request for sleep sounded more like a weary traveler than a sleepy infant. "Bed. Now," he might say, rubbing his eyes with his fists. Sarah and Thomas found themselves responding to him, as if he were a small, very old, and very wise person who just happened to be in a baby's body. He had baby needs, but he expressed them with the voice and seriousness of a grown-up. Even though John's voice was deep and old, Sarah and Thomas quickly learned to understand him. At first, it was a little confusing. A deep up from the cradle didn't sound like a baby wanting to be held, but they soon learned what it meant. They paid close attention to his small hand gestures, the way his blue eyes looked at something, and the tone of his old voice. If he pointed to the window and said, "Outside," in his low rumble, Sarah knew he wanted to be taken for a walk in his pram. If he looked at his empty bowl and said, "More," Thomas understood it wasn't just a sound, but a clear request for more mashed carrots. They learned to ignore the surprise of his voice and simply listen to the words and watch his actions. They found themselves talking to John as if he were a very small, very wise person. "What do you want to play with, little one?" Sarah might ask, and John would point and say, "Bear," in his deep voice. Thomas would read him stories, and John would listen with great attention, sometimes making a deep sound if something interested him. This special way of talking created a very close bond between John and his parents. They were the only ones who truly understood the language of his old man's voice, not just the words, but the feelings behind them. They learned that even with a voice that sounded ancient, John was still their baby, full of baby desires and baby feelings. It was a secret language, in a way, that only their little family shared, making their love for John even more unique and strong. They understood his needs perfectly, no matter how unusual his voice sounded to the rest of the world. While Sarah and Thomas had grown used to John's old man's voice, they knew the outside world hadn't. The constant stream of curious visitors, some kind, some scared, some suspicious, made them worry about John. They didn't want their baby to be seen as a strange show, or to be frightened by people staring. Their main goal was to keep John safe and happy, just like any loving parents would. So, they started to limit visitors. Sarah would politely explain that John was sleeping, or that it was his feeding time. Thomas put up a small sign on their door that read, "Quiet, baby sleeping." They still welcomed close family, like Grandpa Elias, but they tried to keep John away from too many curious eyes. When they took John out for a walk in his pram, Sarah would often pull the hood down a little, so he was tucked away from peering faces. If they went to the market, they tried to go at quieter times. They didn't want him to feel like he was always being watched or judged. They wanted him to have a normal babyhood, even with his very abnormal voice. They spent more time at home, playing with John in their cozy living room or out in their small, fenced garden. They read him stories, sang him songs, and let him play with his wooden toys. They wanted him to feel loved and secure, surrounded by the familiar warmth of his family, rather than the confusing stares of strangers. Sarah and Thomas knew that John was special, but they wanted that specialness to be a joy for him, not a burden. They guarded his peace and happiness with all their hearts, making sure his world was full of love, not just curiosity. As the seasons changed, so did John. He grew from a tiny infant to a more active baby, full of energy and curiosity. His little legs and arms grew stronger, and soon he was no longer content just lying in his cradle or on a blanket. He learned to roll over, then to push himself up on his hands and knees. One sunny afternoon, while Sarah was folding laundry, John surprised her by crawling across the floor to reach a colorful ball. "Ball," he said in his deep, familiar voice as he patted the toy with his small hand. Sarah smiled, watching her growing boy. He looked like any healthy baby learning to move, his cheeks rosy with effort, his eyes bright with discovery. But his voice remained the same. Whether he was cooing happily or grumbling about a dropped toy, the sound was always that of an old man, deep and clear. His movements became more confident each day. He crawled under tables, pulled himself up on chairs, and explored every corner of their cozy home. And with each new exploration, his voice was there, a deep rumble accompanying his baby actions. "Up," he would say, stretching his arms towards Thomas. "Hot," he'd warn himself if he touched the fireplace screen, his voice low and serious. It was a strange sight for anyone not used to it. A tiny baby, barely able to sit up straight, speaking with the tone of someone who had seen many winters. Yet for Sarah and Thomas, it had become their normal. They loved watching him grow and learn, his old man's voice simply another unique part of their wonderful son. His body was changing and developing just as it should, but his voice stayed perfectly the same, a constant, deep sound from a very small boy. As John grew and his old man's voice remained, the initial shock and fear in the town slowly faded away. People couldn't deny what they heard, especially as John grew more talkative. What once seemed scary or a trick began to seem special. The villagers, who loved a good tale and cherished their community, started to see John not as an oddity, but as a unique part of their town. Farmer McGregor, who had insisted it was a trick, eventually heard John ask for more juice in his deep voice, and he had to admit he was wrong. He even started telling stories about the little philosopher to his friends. Mrs. Higgins, who had been so afraid, saw John happily playing with a kitten and realized he was just a sweet baby, despite his voice. She even started knitting him small, warm blankets. The children of the town, especially, grew fascinated with John. They would peek over the garden fence, not to stare in fear, but to listen for his deep voice. Young Timmy still called him the tiny wizard, and they would try to get John to say funny things. When John, in his booming voice, once told a curious child, "Go home, small one," everyone burst out laughing. It became a point of pride for the town. "We have the baby who speaks like an old man," they would tell visitors from other villages. John was no longer just Sarah and Thomas's unusual baby. He was our John, the special boy of the town. His voice, once a source of worry and wonder, was now simply a part of who he was, making him a beloved and celebrated little person in their community. He was different, yes, but different in a wonderful, heart-warming way. As the town slowly began to accept and even celebrate John's unique voice, a deeper understanding settled in Sarah and Thomas's hearts. The early worries, the shock, and the confusion had long since faded. What remained was a clear, strong truth. John was their loving son, no matter how his voice sounded. Sarah often cradled him, feeling his warm, soft body against hers. When he would say, "Mother, hug," in his deep rumble, her heart would melt. It wasn't the sweet, high-pitched voice she might have expected, but the love in the request was just as real, just as pure. She would hug him tightly, feeling his tiny arms squeeze around her neck. His voice didn't change the way he snuggled, or how he laughed when tickled, or how he looked at her with complete trust. Thomas, too, felt this deeply. When John, in his booming voice, would say, "Father, play," Thomas would drop whatever he was doing and get down on the floor. They would roll a ball back and forth, or Thomas would build a tower of blocks for John to knock down. John's deep laughter filled the room, a sound of pure baby joy, even if the laugh itself was unusually low. Thomas realized that the most important thing about John wasn't his voice, but his spirit, his kindness, and his boundless love. They had come to understand that his voice was simply a part of him, like the color of his eyes or the shape of his nose. It didn't change his gentle nature, his curiosity, or his need for their love. He was still their baby, their miracle, and their greatest joy. They wouldn't trade his old man's voice for anything, because it was part of the unique little boy they cherished so much. Their love for John was bigger than any strange sound, and that was all that truly mattered. Knowing that John was their beloved baby, voice or no voice, Sarah and Thomas focused on raising him with strong, good values. They knew John was different, and that his voice would always make him stand out. Because of this, they felt it was very important to teach him to be kind and brave. Sarah would gently remind him to share his toys, even when his deep voice might protest. "Mine." She would explain, "Sharing makes others happy, John. It's a kind thing to do." She taught him to be gentle with their small cat, and to offer a comforting pat to anyone who seemed sad. She wanted him to understand that even though he sounded grown up, he still needed to act with a gentle heart. Thomas, with his calm and steady nature, taught John about bravery. "It's all right to be different, John," he would say, holding the boy's tiny hand. "Your voice is special. Don't let anyone make you feel bad about it." He encouraged John to explore and try new things, even if it meant falling down sometimes. "Get up, little man," Thomas would say, his own voice full of encouragement. "You are strong." He wanted John to be proud of who he was, to stand tall and confident, even when people stared or whispered. They talked to John about how his voice might surprise people, but that he should always be polite and true to himself. They hoped these lessons would give him a strong foundation, helping him to navigate a world that might not always understand him. Their goal was to raise a happy, loving, and courageous boy who knew his worth, no matter how extraordinary his voice made him seem, They wanted John to be kind to others and brave enough to be himself. As John grew, learning to crawl and explore with his deep voice always at the ready, he became more than just the baby with the old man's voice. He became a cherished part of the town itself, woven into its very fabric and history. His unique gift, once a source of wonder and sometimes fear, was now a beloved story passed from person to person. Children would play games pretending to have an old man's voice, trying to mimic John's deep tones. Grandparents would bounce their own grandchildren on their knees, telling them tales of little John, who spoke like a wise old sage even before he could walk. His sayings, like "more milk, please," or "cold," became gentle jokes and fond memories within the community. The town, which had once been a little too quick to judge or disbelieve, had learned a valuable lesson from John. They learned that being different wasn't something to fear, but something to celebrate. John, with his clear blue eyes and his deep, rumbling voice, showed them that a person's true worth wasn't in how they sounded or how they looked, but in their heart and spirit. He brought a special kind of warmth and charm to the town. His presence was a reminder that life held wonderful surprises, and that sometimes the most unexpected things could bring the most joy. John became a legend in his own time, a sweet, kind baby whose old man's voice made him unforgettable. He was truly a beloved part of the town's history, a living story that everyone treasured. The seasons continued to turn, and John, the baby with the old man's voice, grew into a bustling, cheerful toddler. His legs were sturdy, his steps were quick, and his curiosity led him on many adventures around the house and garden. He loved to chase butterflies, stack wooden blocks, and listen to his mother sing, often joining in with his deep, rumbling voice. He was a happy child, full of giggles and smiles, just like any other toddler. He would run to Sarah for a hug, his tiny arms reaching up, and he would call out, "Mother!" in his deep voice, his face beaming with joy. He would help Thomas in the workshop, handing him tools with a serious "Hammer, Father," and then laugh a deep, hearty laugh when Thomas praised him. His voice was still the same, a constant, unchanging deep tone that came from his small, energetic body. It never changed, never grew higher like a child's voice usually would. It was simply John's voice, unique and unforgettable. But it didn't bother him, and it certainly didn't bother his parents or the town anymore. The people of the town had grown accustomed to it. When John would join his parents at the market, his deep voice might be heard asking for "apple, please," from the fruit stand, and the vendor would smile, happy to serve little John. He was loved and accepted for exactly who he was. The story of John, the baby who spoke in an old man's voice, became a cherished part of the town's history, a tale told and retold with warmth and fondness. And John, a happy, healthy toddler, continued to live his life, speaking in his wonderfully unique way, a testament to how even the most unusual differences can bring joy and love to the world. He was a bright, kind boy, and his special voice was just one of the many things that made him truly extraordinary.